In Greek mythology, the Greek underworld, or Hades, is a distinct realm where an individual goes after death. The earliest idea of an afterlife in Greek myth is that, at the moment of death, an individual's essence, psyche, is separated from the corpse and transported to the underworld. In early mythology, that of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the dead were indiscriminately grouped together and led to a shadowy post-existence. However, in later mythology, particularly in relation to Platonic philosophy, elements of post-mortem judgment began to emerge, with good and bad people being separated, both spatially and with regards to treatment. The underworld itself, commonly referred to as Hades, after its patron god, is described as being located in a periphery of Earth, either associated with the outer limits of the ocean or beneath the Earth. The underworld is made solely for the dead, and so mortals do not enter it, with only a few heroic exceptions who undertook a mythical catabasis or mortal journey to the underworld. They include the likes of Hercules, Theseus, Orpheus, possibly also Odysseus, and in later Roman descriptions, Aeneas. Darkness and a lack of sunlight are common features associated with the underworld, and in this way provide a direct contrast to both the normality of the land of the living, where the sun shines, and also with the brightness associated with Mount Olympus, the realm of the gods. The underworld is also considered to be an invisible realm. I am Daniel, this is Cogito Ergo Pod, and in this episode we are going to shed some overworldly light on the Greek-Roman post-mortem destination of Hades. Let us start then on this journey by taking a geographical tour of how to enter Hades and what we would expect to see therein. Originally, the location of Hades was considered to be beyond the limits of Earth's surface. It was believed to be located beneath Oceanus, a great ocean which encircled the world and was considered the source of all fresh water. Heavenly bodies, such as stars, planets, sun and the moon, were believed to rise and set in these waters. However, as time passed, Hades moved from beyond the edges of the world to under the surface of it. Therefore, the underworld became very under and could be considered to be directly under your feet. However, if it was that close, then surely there must be ways to access it from the surface of the earth. Such access points include Cape Matapan, known in antiquity as Cape Taenarus, on the Mani Peninsula in Greece. Here it was believed that the Greek hero and demigod Hercules dragged the beast Cerberus to the surface, and also where Orpheus descended to the underworld to retrieve his love, Eurydice. The bottomless Aclonian lake, now a marshland, was also considered to be a point of entry for Hades. It was there that the feared Hydra dwelt, and it was also where Dionysus entered to retrieve his mother Semele from the underworld. Lake Avernus, in the Campania region of southern Italy, was believed by the Romans to be the entrance to their underworld, and it was the portal where Aeneas used to descend in Virgil's Aeneid. However, there is a wall called Erebus around Hades that hides it from the mortal realm and life. It is controlled by its namesake, the primordial god Erebus. However, once you have found a way to descend the boundaries of living and post-mortem worlds, you will then need to traverse the complex geography of where you will find yourself. Rivers are a fundamental part of topography of the underworld and are found in the earliest source materials. In Homer's Iliad, the ghost of Patroclus makes specific mention of gates and a river, unnamed, in Hades. In Homer's Odyssey, the ghost of Odysseus' mother, Anticlea, describes there being many great rivers and appalling streams, and reference is made to at least 4 specific rivers. In the wider mythological tradition, however, there are multiple bodies of water that are associated with the underworld, varying in number and combination depending on source, the names of which can be understood to reflect specific associations with death. The river Styx can be considered the most prominent and familiar of the underworld rivers. It is the only named underworld river mentioned in Homer's Iliad, our earliest mythological text, and 3 of the Homeric hymns. The deities of the Greek pantheon swore all their oaths upon the river Styx because, according to Greek mythology, during the Titanomachy, Styx, the goddess of the river, sided with Zeus. After the war, Zeus declared that every oath must be sworn upon her. According to some, the river Styx had miraculous powers which could make someone who bathed in the waters invulnerable. According to one tradition, Achilles' mother dipped him in the river during his childhood, and he thus acquired invulnerability, with the exception of the heel, which his mother held on to him by. Achilles was struck and killed during the Trojan War by an arrow shot into his heel by Paris. This is the source of the expression Achilles' heel, a metaphor for a vulnerable spot. In later traditions, it is often served as the entrance to the underworld over which Charon, the ferryman of the dead, rose the deceased in order for them to enter the underworld. It is also known as the River of Hatred. The river Styx was believed to encircle the underworld 7 times. Styx, as I've said, is also known as the goddess of the river, the source of its miraculous powers. The Acheron is a river of misery, or a river of woe, considered to be dark and depthless. It is mentioned in many early sources of archaic poetry, but is less prominent and early than the Styx. In some mythological accounts, Charon rose the dead over the Acheron rather than the Styx. In some alternative sources, Acheron is a lake rather than as well as a river, and also functions as a synonym for the underworld. The Pyrophlegion, or the Phlegion, is a river of blazing fire, pyrophlegion being from the phrase pyriphlegethonic, blazing like fire. It has a single mention in Homer's Odyssey, where it is described as flowing into the river Acheron, and then does not appear again in sources until Plato. According to Plato, this river leads to the depths of Tartarus and is associated with punishment, in particular people who hit their fathers and mothers. There was a river or field of this name near Cumia, maintaining its association with burning due to the local hot springs. The Cocytus is a river of wailing, coming from cocyun, to weep or lament. It, too, has only a single mention in Homer's Odyssey, where it is described as a branch of the Styx that flows into the Acheron. According to Plato, Cocytus is circular and empties into Tartarus, and is associated with the punishment of murderers. It is also the name of a river in Thesprotia and Cumia. The Lethe is a river of forgetfulness, taking its name from Lethe, the goddess of forgetfulness and oblivion. In later accounts, a poplar branch, dripping with water of the Lethe, became the symbol of Hypnos, the god of sleep. Some sources reference a plain of Lethe rather than a river. Souls undergoing reincarnation were forced to drink from the river in order to forget their past life and the underworld. Only after drinking could a soul be reborn in the living world. Now that we have dealt with the water features available in the Greco-Roman underworld, it's time to take a look at the locations that you can enjoy visiting while you're down there. The Land of the Dead is the main part of the underworld. This is the place where Hades rules the rest of the realm. In the Land of the Dead, the souls of the dead still exist, but they are insubstantial and they flitted around the underworld with no sense of purpose. The dead within the underworld lack menos, or strength, and therefore they cannot influence those on earth. They also lack phrenes, or wit, and are heedless of what goes on around them and on the earth above them. Their lives in the underworld were very neutral, so all social statuses and political positions were eliminated, and no one was able to use their previous lives to their advantage in the underworld. In some Greek sources, Tartarus is another name for the underworld, serving as the metonym for Hades, while in others it is a completely distinct realm, separate from the underworld. Hesiod most famously described Tartarus as being as far beneath the underworld as the earth is beneath the sky. Like Hades, It too is so dark that the night is poured around it in 3 rows like a collar around the neck, while above it grow the roots of the earth and the unharvested sea. Tartarus is known for being the place where the worst transgressors would go. The most famous inhabitants of Tartarus are the Titans, who were cast down there by Zeus along with Zeus's father Cronus after he defeated them. Homer wrote that Cronus then became the king of Tartarus. Other occupants include King Sisyphus, who was sent to Tartarus for killing guests and travellers at his castle in violation of his hospitality, seducing his niece, and reporting one of Zeus's sexual conquests by telling the river god Asopus of the whereabouts of his daughter Aegina, who had been taken away by Zeus. Long story short, Sisyphus was forced forever to roll a large boulder to the top of a mountain slope, which, no matter how many times he nearly succeeded in his attempt, would always roll back to the bottom. King Tantalus also ended up in Tartarus after he cut up his own son Pelops, boiled him, and served him as food when he was invited to dine with the gods. He also stole the ambrosia from the gods and told his people its secrets. Tantalus's punishment for his actions, now a proverbial term for temptation without satisfaction, was to stand in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree with low branches. Whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches raised his intended meal from his grasp. Whenever he bent down to get a drink, the water receded before he could get any. Over his head towered the threatening stone, like that of Sisyphus. Ixion was the king of Lapiths, the most ancient tribe of Thessaly. Ixion grew to hate his father-in-law and ended up pushing him onto a bed of coals and wood, committing the first kin-related murder. The princes of other lands ordered that Ixion be denied the cleansing of his sin. Zeus took pity on Ixion and invited him to a meal on Olympus. But when Ixion saw Hera, he fell in love with her and did some under-the-table caressing until Zeus signalled him to stop. After finding a place for Ixion to sleep, Zeus created a cloud clone of Hera named Nephele to test him to see how far he would go to seduce Hera. Ixion made love to her. Zeus drove Ixion from Mount Olympus and then struck him with a thunderbolt. He was punished by being tied to a winged flaming wheel that was always spinning, first in the sky and then in Tartarus. Only when Orpheus came down to the underworld to rescue Eurydice did it stop spinning because of the music Orpheus was playing. Ixion being strapped to the flaming wheel represented his burning lust. Now, according to Plato, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, and Minos were the judges of the dead and chose who went to Tartarus. Rhadamanthus judged Asian souls, Aeacus judged European souls, and Minos was the deciding vote and judge of the Greek. In Plato's Gorgias, souls are judged after death, and Tartarus is where the wicked receive divine punishment. Tartarus is also considered to be a primordial force or deity alongside entities such as earth, night, and time. In Roman mythology, sinners, as defined by the Roman societal cultural norms of their time, are sent to Tartarus for punishment after death. Virgil describes Tartarus in great detail in the Aeneid. He describes it as expansive. It is surrounded by 3 perimeter walls, beyond which flows a flaming river named the Phlegion. To further preserve escape, a hydra with 50 black gaping jaws sits atop a gate that screeches when opened. They are flanked by adamantine columns, a substance that, like diamond, is so hard nothing can cut through it. Inside the walls of Tartarus sits a wide-walled castle with a tall iron turret. Tisiphon, one of the Erinyes, or Furies, who represent vengeance, stands sleepless guard at the top of the turret, lashing her whip. Roman mythology describes a pit inside extending down into the earth twice as far as the distance from the lands of the living to Olympus. The twin sons of Titan Elios were said to be imprisoned at the bottom of this pit. The next stop on our tour is the Elysian Fields, Elysian supposedly meaning to be deeply stirred with joy. Here is a utopian paradise-like afterlife reserved for specially distinguished individuals. Some place the fields on an archipelago known as the Island of the Blessed, or that the islands were only in an area within the fields. More of this in a moment. The Elysian Fields are first referenced in Homer's Odyssey, Book 4, where Menelaus is promised that he will go there instead of dying, and so distinguishing it from the afterlife proper. It is described as being located at the edges of the earth, and is where life is easiest for men. Some place the fields on the archipelago known as the Islands of the Blessed. However, Menelaus does not achieve this fate, not due to anything that he has done during his lifetime, but rather because he is Zeus's son-in-law, being married to Helen. In Hesiod's Working Days, however, this is a paradise that heroes could attain. Eventually, as concepts of afterlife broadened and became more democratic, the generally righteous could be sent to the Elysian Fields after being judged by the underworld judges. Once there, the lucky souls could expect to participate in sports, wrestle in gold and yellow sand, sing, dance, and recite poetry. Sounds like an eternity at the Edinburgh Fringe. When a soul achieved Elysium, they had a choice to either stay in Elysium or to be reborn. If the soul was reborn 3 times and returned after death to Elysium all 3 times, then they were sent to the Islands of the Blessed to live in eternal paradise. One of the lesser-known areas of the underworld is the Asphodel Meadows. This is most probably where the souls of people who live mediocre lives remain, so at least I know where I'm going. Its relationship to other places in the Greek afterlife remains uncertain. Some depictions describe it as a land of utter neutrality. So, Switzerland then. In that, while the inhabitants were in life neither good nor evil, so they are treated in the afterlife. Other descriptions have also stated that all residents drink from the river Lithi before entering the fields, thus losing their identities. This somewhat negative outlook on the afterlife for those who make little impact was perhaps passed down to encourage militarism in Greek cultures, as opposed to inaction. In fact, those who did take up arms and became heroes were rewarded with everlasting joy in the fields of Elysium. Finally, we have the Mourning Fields, or the Lugente Campi, which was a section of the underworld reserved for souls who wasted their lives on unrequited love. Those mentioned as residents of this place are Dido, Phaedra, Procrus, Eriphyle, Pasiphae, Evadne, Laodamia, and Camus. Now that we know the sights that we can enjoy when we get down there, it's time to find out what kind of company we're going to keep. First, we have the god who shares the name with the underworld, everyone's favourite James Wood character, Hades. Hades, the eldest son of the Titans Kronos and Rhea, brother of Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, is the Greek god of the underworld. When the 3 brothers divided the world between themselves, Zeus received the heavens, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. The earth itself was divided between the 3. Therefore, while Hades' responsibility was in the underworld, he was allowed to have power on earth as well. However, Hades himself is rarely seen outside of his domain, and to those on earth his intentions and personality are a mystery. In art and literature, Hades is depicted as a stern and dignified individual, but not as a fierce torturer or devil-like. However, Hades was considered the enemy to all life and was hated by both the gods and men. Sacrifices and prayers did not appease him as mortals rarely tried. He was also not a tormentor of the dead, and sometimes considered that Zeus of the dead, because he was hospitable to them. Due to his role as Lord of the Underworld, though, and ruler of the dead, he was also known as Zeus Kythinios, the infernal Zeus, or Zeus of the lower world. In Greek society, many viewed Hades as the least like god, and many gods even had an aversion towards him. And when people would sacrifice to Hades, it would be if they wanted revenge on an enemy, or something terrible to befall them. Hades was sometimes referred to as Pluton, and was represented in a lighter way. Here he was considered the giver of wealth, since the crops and the blessing of the harvest came from below the earth. Now, we know that behind every great man is an even greater woman, and Hades is no different. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and Zeus. Persephone was abducted by Hades, who desired a wife. When Persephone was gathering flowers, she was entranced by a narcissus flower planted by Gaia to lure her to the underworld as a favour to Hades. When she picked it, the earth suddenly opened up. Hades, appearing in a golden chariot, seduced and carried Persephone into the underworld. When Demeter found out that Zeus had given Hades permission to abduct Persephone and take her as his wife, Demeter became enraged at Zeus and stopped growing harvests for the earth. To soothe her, Zeus sent Hermes to the underworld to return Persephone to her mother. However, she had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds in the underworld and was thus eternally tied to the underworld, since the pomegranate seed was sacrificed there. Persephone could then only leave the underworld when the earth was blooming, or every season except winter. Persephone herself is considered a fitting other half to Hades because of the meaning of her name, which bears the Greek root for killing, and phone, meaning putting to death. The Erinyes, also known as the Furies, were the 3 goddesses associated with the souls of the dead and the avenged crimes against the natural order of the world. They consisted of Alecto, Megara, and Tisiphon. They were particularly concerned with crimes done by children against their parents. They would inflict madness upon the living murderer, or if a nation was harbouring such a criminal, the Erinyes would cause starvation and disease to the nation. The Erinyes were dreaded by the living since they embodied the vengeance of a person who was wronged against. Often the Greeks made soothing libations to the Erinyes to appease them so as to not invoke their wrath, and overall they received many more libations and sacrifices than other gods of the underworld. The Erinyes were depicted as ugly and winged women with their bodies intertwined with serpents. We have already met the lovely trio of Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. They were the judges of the dead. They judged the deeds of the deceased and created the laws that governed the underworld. Aeacus was the guardian of the keys of the underworld and the judge of the men of Europe. Rhadamanthus was the lord of Elysium and judged the men of Asia, while Minos was the judge of the final vote. Another returning character is Charon the ferryman, who, after receiving a soul, would guide them across the river Styx and or Acheron to the underworld. At funerals, the deceased traditionally had an abol placed over their eye or under their tongue, so that they could pay Charon to take them across. If not, they were said to lie at the shores for 100 years until they were allowed to cross the river. To the Etruscans of pre-Roman Italy, Charon was considered a fearsome being. He wielded a hammer and was hook-nosed, bearded, and had animalistic ears with teeth. In another early Greek description, Charon was considered merely an ugly bearded man with a conical hat and tunic. Later on, in more modern Greek folklore, he was considered more angelic, like the Archangel Michael. Nevertheless, Charon was considered a terrifying being since his duty was to bring these souls to the underworld, and no one would persuade him to do otherwise. Not all known inhabitants of Hades were humanoid, though. Cerberus, or Hellhound, is Hades' massive multi-headed dog, with some descriptions stating that it also had a snake-headed tail and snake heads on its back and as its mane. Born from Echidna and Typhon, Cerberus guards the gate that serves as the entrance to the underworld. Cerberus's duty is to prevent dead people from leaving the underworld. Hercules once borrowed Cerberus as a final part of his labours. Orpheus once soothed it to sleep with his music. According to the Suda, the ancient Greeks placed a honey cake with the dead in order for the dead to give it to Cerberus. Other mythological figures who also reside in the underworld include Thanatos, god of the dead, Hypnos, god of sleep and twin brother of Thanatos, Milano, chthonic nymph and bringer of nightmares and madness, Nyx, goddess of night, Aklis, personification of misery and sadness, and everyone's favourite daemon, not to be confused with demons though, is Eurynomus, who is responsible for eating the flesh of the corpses of the dead, leaving only bones. What a fun job. Yeah, it feels like we're missing something important. The dead. In the Greek underworld, the souls of the dead still existed, but they are insubstantial and flitted around the underworld with no sense of purpose. The dead within the Homeric underworld lack menos or strength, and therefore they could not influence those on earth. They also lacked feros or wit, and are heedless of going around them and on earth above them. Their lives in the underworld were very neutral, so all social statuses and political positions were eliminated, and no one was able to use their previous lives to their advantage in the underworld. The idea of progress did not exist in the Greek underworld. At the moment of death, the psyche was frozen, in experience and appearance. The souls of the underworld did not age or really change in any sense. They did not lead any sort of active life in the old underworld. They were exactly the same as they were in life. Therefore, those who had died in battle were eternally blood-splattered in the underworld, and those that died peacefully were able to remain that way. Overall, the Greek dead were considered to be irritable and unpleasant, but not dangerous or malevolent. They grew angry if they felt a hostile presence near their graves, and drink offerings were given in order to appease them, so as not to anger the dead. Mostly, blood offerings were given, because they needed the essence of life to become communicative and conscious again. There was not a general consensus as to whether the dead were able to consume food or not. Homer's depiction of the dead as unable to eat or drink unless they had been summoned. However, some reliefs portray the underworld as having many elaborate feasts. While not completely clear, it is implied that the dead could still have sexual intimacy with another, although no children were produced. The Greeks also showed belief in the possibility of marriage in the underworld, which in a sense implies the Greek underworld was little different from the world above. Hades itself was free from the concept of time. The dead were aware of both the past and future, and in poems describing Greek heroes, the dead helped move the plot of the story by prophesying and telling truths unknown to the hero. The only way for humans to communicate with the dead was to suspend time and their normal life to reach Hades, the place beyond immediate perception and human time. The Greeks had a definite belief that there was a journey to the afterlife or another world. They believed that death was not a complete end to life or human existence. They accepted the existence of the soul after death and saw this afterlife as meaningless. In the underworld, the identity of the dead person still existed, but it had no strength or true influence. Rather, the continuation of the existence of the soul in the underworld was considered a remembrance of the fact that the dead person had existed, yet while the soul still existed, it was inactive. However, the price of death was considered a great one. Homer believed that the best possible existence for humans was to never be born at all, or die soon after birth, because the greatness of life could never balance the price of death. The Greek gods only rewarded heroes who were still living. Heroes that died were ignored in the afterlife. It was considered very important to the Greeks to honour the dead, and was seen as a type of piety. Those who did not respect the dead opened themselves up to the punishment of the gods. For example, Odysseus ensuring Ajax's burial, or the gods would be angered. So there you have it, folks. We have swum the rivers, dealt with Cerberus and the Furies, flirted with Persephone, and followed in Theresa May's footsteps by running through the wheat of the Elysium fields. This was a fun episode to research, as it was such an interesting topic. I love the old and netherworldly, and so it ticks plenty of boxes. Considering the efforts of early Christianity to wipe opposition to them off the map, it is wonderful we still have such a fruitful knowledge of what ancient Greeks and Romans believed about their afterlife. I'm sure there will be plenty more episodes on this kind of otherworldly area. After all, we have a world full of fanciful and fascinating worlds that can only be discovered by shuffling off this mortal coil, or, as I wrote in an essay at university, this moral toil. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the follow button, the download button, and leave me a review. You can find these episodes on YouTube as well if you search Cogito Ergo Pod, and you can listen back and like or comment. And you'll also find me on Instagram at Cogito_Ergo_Pod. So, as ever, until next time, thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you again soon.